Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. So this afternoon, I wanted to talk about one of, if not the most important insights and teachings of the Buddha, which is sunyata, emptiness, and Anata, and the related concept Anata, not self. This is a core teaching in many ways. One of the reasons for that is that it is the teaching which is unique to Buddhism. You'll find in India at the Buddhist time and before and after was very rich in philosophical and spiritual speculation. And there are many, many schools, both Buddhist and non-Buddhist. They had many different views and teachings on different things. The one teaching that's found only in the Buddhist schools and is common to all the Buddhist schools is teaching of emptiness. And it's an extremely liberating idea. It's really the skeleton key that unlocks everything else. If you have a good appreciation, internalized understanding, and grounding in not self and emptiness, then all the gates are open to you. It's really very central, and it's something that is not easily grasped at first. And this was even recognized at the Buddhist time. I mean, in some of the Buddhist discourses, you get a reaction from people when he teaches emptiness. Some people become afraid. They see it as annihilation. Which it definitely is not. So to begin with explaining this, I always think it's useful to put things into context. That the Buddha was teaching in a specific time and place and a context of existing ideas. And we have a tendency to interpret things through the lens of our own modern presuppositions, which often then becomes subtly misleading. So to begin with, let's consider what were the teachings in the society of India at the time of the Buddha that he was critiquing. He called his teaching on personality, he called it Anata, not self. As the negative prefix, and Atta is Sanskrit Atman, was a concept very common in India, found particularly in the Upanishads, and later it's found in texts like the Bhagavad Gita. Atman was considered to be the imperishable, unchangeable essence of a human being. There's a passage in the Bhagavad Gita that talks about reincarnation as the Atman moving from body to body, just as a man waking up in the morning, gets out of bed and puts on a suit of clothes. And at the end of the day, he takes the suit of clothes off and goes into bed. So the man is wearing the suits of clothes, just as the Atman wears different bodies. And the Buddha continued to teach rebirth, beings coming into existence again and again according to their karma. But he denied that there's anything that moves from body to body. And this is perplexing. This is one of the frequently asked questions, is how can Buddhism teach not self or no soul, or however you want to translate Anata? How can it teach that and at the same time teach rebirth? The issue here is that the question is based on a false implicit assumption that anyone who finds a contradiction there is assuming that there's something which continues essentially from moment to moment within this lifetime. Rather than seeing it as a series of causally linked moments, there's an attachment to the idea of some imperishable essence. And this is this becomes formalized in the idea of an Atman, which is also very similar to the Western idea of a soul. There's some immortal, imperishable essence in a human being. The Buddha's teaching was the middle path. He denied eternalism, but he also denied materialism, or as it's called in the Pali, Uchedawada, annihilationism, literally the cutting off view. This is the view that was held by some in India and now by many moderns, that the human being is nothing really more than a machine made out of meat, and that at the end of life everything is cut off and there's no continuity. The Buddha denied that, but he also denied that there's any eternal thing which continues. There's just the endless process of cause and effect. So one of the phrases that that I've heard that sums up the Buddhist view of rebirth is consciousness arising again to like conditions. In each moment, consciousness in their life, consciousness is arising to conditions. And at death, the only difference is that the physical base is no longer functional, so the consciousness must arise somewhere else. This is the idea of Anata, which is, we could say, a special case of a more general principle of sunyata, voidness or emptiness. Sunya means empty, and ata is a suffix that makes a noun out of an adjective. So sunyata is emptiness. And again, let's put this into the Indian context. There was a prevailing philosophical view in India that anything, any substance or atom of existence had a inherent essence, which was then overlaid or modified by different qualities. There's a very similar way of looking at reality that was held by the ancient Greeks, and Aristotle spoke about essence and qualities. And in India, the term was svabhava, own essence, or own being. So there's some inherent core in everything, and then it's modified by ephemeral qualities that might be changeable, such as temperature, size, weight, color, like this. But the Buddhist view came to be, this is not explicitly in the Buddhist teachings, but himself, but in the Abhidhamma and in later texts, when they started like crossing the T's and dotting the I's and working out the details, they denied that there is really a svabhava. There's only the qualities. The svabhava is non-real. There's no substance. So that any phenomena is just a transient causal nexus of other events. There's a phrase from the Tibetan that nothing exists from its own side, which I think sums it up very well. The point of view here. So it's not a world of things. There's no hard little billiard ball atoms. There's only an interplay of forces. And it's interesting, I think, that in the 20th century, Western science, physics, came around to something very like this view. If we take physics as it was understood up till about the time of the First World War, say late 19th century, early 20th century, Western physics, it was the furthest remove possible from Buddhist teaching. The universe was composed of atoms which were like little billiard balls. But then with the dawn of quantum mechanics, this became less and less tenable. An electron is not seen now as a discrete object, but as a probability wave. This is quite different, and the more we look at the finest grain of material reality, the less substantial it seems. And there's even considerable evidence that the material reality does not exist independently of the mind. This is the implication of the Copenhagen interpretation of quantum mechanics, that a generation or more of materialist physicists try to wiggle out of and find some other explanation. But now there's more and more experimental evidence, some of it quite recent, that material reality does not exist unless there's an observer, unless consciousness is present. Otherwise, there's only a potential field. So this potential field is very like the great emptiness, the sunyata of Buddhism. This emptiness is not, the sunyata is not a completely sterile nothingness. It's potential. It's all potential. You know, the Tibetans often use imagery comparing it to a womb, which is space in a woman's body. Just an empty space, but it has a potential of a life forming in there. So sunyata, because it's void, it's empty, it's universally potent. It has every possibility of manifesting anything. So when things actually manifest, when there's actual discrete objects and beings manifesting out of emptiness, that's in a sense a flaw. It's kind of a brokenness. You know, it's a little fragment. And the universal potential is no longer present. It's now concretized for some brief period as some sort of entity. And this applies on all scales of being, from the minutest atom to the galaxies and cosmos as a whole. So this is the idea of sunyata, universal emptiness. It's a general principle. It's a philosophical or theoretical principle, and it's useful and good to hold that as a view. But as a practical application for a human person's psychology and spiritual life is the special case of Anata, of not-self. Because it's a burdensome view to hold that there's such a thing as a self. When one is burdened with the idea of a self, then one suffers from fear, because anything changing is perceived as a threat to this self. And one can be subject to defilements of pride and aggressiveness and many other things based on a feeling, an inherent feeling of a self. And it's something that is very implicit in ordinary human beings. It can be elaborated into a whole philosophical system, as we saw in India, and also in Western philosophical systems. The idea of a self or a soul or inherent unchanging aspect of being. It's a very common philosophical position, but it doesn't even have to be elaborated like that. It can be just implicitly assumed and taken for granted. That's probably the more common case. But if you look at the workings of the body-mind, you don't find a self anywhere. This is the classic example that's cited many times of Melinda's chariot. When King Melinda was discussing the Buddhist teaching of not-self with the monk Nagasena, Nagasena gave a simile and said, this chariot that you came in here, O king, if we were to tear the chariot apart and put the wheels over here and the backboard over there and so on, and there was a pile of parts and pieces, could you find in that pile of pieces, could you find for me the essence of chariot? And the king had to admit there's no such thing. And after some more back and forth Socratic type of dialogue, he got the king to define chariot as nothing more than a conventional designation that refers to this pile of parts when they're properly arranged. But it has no inherent essence or reality of its own. There's no svabhava of a chariot. It's just composed of parts and pieces. And Nagasena said, so it is with this human organism. There is the body, there's consciousness, there's feelings, there's perceptions, there's mental formations. And nowhere in any of these is there an essence of Nagasena or an essence of Malinda. But we use those as conventional designations when these parts are arranged such and such a way and functioning. Then we can use a conventional designation. But it's not referring to any real essence. And in fact, the idea of a self, or an Anata, or a soul, or however you want to call it, is completely redundant. It's unnecessary. It doesn't have any explanatory value. It's a useless addition. Now we could update to make this clear, let's update the story of Melinda's chariot. And have the story of Melinda's Chevrolet. Let's say this guy Melinda, he bought a new car and he's so proud and happy with it. And he's showing it to his friend Nagasena. And Melinda doesn't know anything about cars, how they work. He just likes a nice shiny car that goes fast. Cool. But Nagasena is a Class A mechanic. So Nagasena is playing with his friend, but he says, so do you know how this car works, how it runs? And Melinda says, yeah, I thought about it. And I'm pretty sure there's a green goblin that lives under the hood that makes everything go. And Melinda says, that's crazy. There's no such thing as a green goblin in your car. Well, yeah, okay, then what makes the wheels turn? Well, that's the crankshaft turning and through the gears and the transmission. It turns the axle, turns the wheels. Okay, well, the green goblin's turning the crankshaft round and round. No, that's the pistons firing and driving the up and down in the cylinders. Well, then the green goblin's doing that. No, that's the spark plugs exploding. The spark explodes the gas. It causes the piston to depress. Well, the spark comes from the green goblin. No, that comes from the distributor cap. And you go on and on and on and on like that. And you can explain the whole operation of the car. And the only time the green goblin comes into it is when you don't know how something works. And you say, well, that must be the green goblin. So it is with the human organism. Thought arises, for example, but there's no one doing the thinking. Consciousness alights on an object, but there's no one being conscious, right? And the more you examine the details, the less room there is for that Atta. But it's very difficult because it's such an ingrained assumption in the ordinary human being. And it's said that it's only really after stream entry that a person can fully grasp the idea of not self. prior to that, one can approach the idea, and should, with the intellect, and it's can be approached from two directions. It's kind of, and then it's kind of like a mathematical asymptote. You can get closer and closer without quite reaching the 0 point until the moment of stream entry. But that becomes easier the closer you get to 0. Now, one direction is the method of analysis, which is basically Melinda's chariot. It's looking at the workings of the system, the mind-body system, at a finer and finer grain. And this is the purpose of studying Abhidhamma, for example. And it also becomes more and more evident with Vipassana meditation. You see that there's just this object, and there's consciousness arising to this object, and there's no third besides. And the third besides being the self. And the closer and the more minutely you examine that, the less reason there is to assume a self. You see the operation working just perfectly fine without one. So this is working at a finer and finer grain of examination. The other direction of approach is what we would call the relational approach, is the idea of interdependent origination. Nothing exists from its own side. Everything is merely a result of causes external to itself. Any particular event, phenomenon, object existing in the world doesn't exist as an independent unit, cannot exist as an independent unit. It's only a reflection of external forces. And they're all interrelated, they all affect one another, and it's only perceived as a collection of discrete objects because of false perception, our limited perception, because we don't see the whole picture. And the more you understand about causality and the particular teaching of dependent origination, the more evident this becomes. You see nothing as a self-existent entity. This is a way of looking at things that was very prominent in Huayan Buddhism, a school of Buddhism that developed in China from the Avatangsa Sutra. And they very much emphasize the interdependent nature of reality. And they have some really profound imagery that they use in their teachings to expound on this. One of them is Indra's net. You may have heard of this, that the god Indra, the Saka, has in his palace a decoration, this three-dimensional weave of silver threads in a complex web of interrelated lines crossing. And at each point where the threads cross, there's a jewel. And these are multifaceted jewels. And if you examine any facet of any jewel, the whole web is reflected in that jewel, including all the other jewels and their facets. And then you can look even closer and see those reflected facets. You'll see the entire net reflected again with all its jewels and so on in an infinite regress. So the whole thing becomes just a reflection of itself endlessly. So there's these two approaches to understanding not-self, the analytical and the relational. And as I said, it only begins to become really evident with stream entry. And it's this illusion of a self is actually very naughty. It's very deeply ingrained and it's layered. Now, this is another important teaching about the self-view, is that even at stream entry, it's only one level of the self-view that's transcended. There are really three levels to self-making. That's the reason it's so difficult for us to see through it. The first level is called Sakaya Ditti. Own body view is a literal translation. It's usually translated personality view. This is the one that's overcome with stream entry, and it occurs at the cognitive level. So prior to stream entry, the person is always prone to fall into either the annihilation view or the eternalist view. And it's very hard to balance on that razor edge of the middle path of seeing the unreality of any kind of self. And this level of self-making is essentially cognitive. You can say it's a cognitive disorder, that we understand things in terms of the self. And the stream winner it's no longer possible for the stream winner to hold either the eternalist or the annihilationist view. Their mind just can't hold that as a reality. Think of an ordinary, say, an ordinary educated person, and you try and tell them that the moon is made of green cheese. They can imagine that and maybe play with it in their head a little bit, but they can't believe it. They say, oh, that's ridiculous. How could that be? So it's a view that cannot be held, cannot be entertained seriously in the mind. So does the self-view, Sakaya Ditti, cannot be seriously entertained by the stream winner. Because having glimpsed the unconditioned, the conditioned is now understood in a new way. And any idea of a substantiality of an essence of things falls away, becomes impossible to hold. But then this is only the first level, beginning to unravel this complex of the self, which doesn't exist in any reality, but it's a mental formation that's very difficult to unravel. It's like a complex knot in the mind. And usually when this idea is presented, they'll jump to the third level, the asmimana, but there's actually mention in one text of an intermediate level that I think is quite important to also grasp. So someone is a stream winner, but hasn't gone any further. They no longer believe in a self, but they're still subject to sensuality, desire. And the second level of self is based on that. So it's more what we would call selfishness or greediness. The mind can still be prone to that. An example is that it's possible that stream winner, even though he doesn't believe in me as a reality, he might still want the last cookie on the plate for me, right? This is a more visceral level. There's no cognitive complexity to it, and it's only This is attenuated. Sensuality, which is the base of this, is attenuated with the second stage, sakadagami, and the third stage, anagami, only overcomes it completely. So the anagami is free of that, of those first two levels of self-making, but there still remains one more, which is asmi mana, the I am conceit. And this is very subtle, and it's uh, perplexing at first to understand how is this different from Sakaya Ditti. But the explanation is that Sakaya Ditti is a cognitive level, and Asmi Mana is based on perception, sanya. There's a perception of the world as divided into self and other. So it's a lack of universal relativity. The world is perceived as divided into this dichotomy of self and other. And that perception remains even in the mind stream of an anagami. It's only the arahant that sees through it completely with the eradication of ignorance. So we can see this delusion of the self cuts very deep. And one more thing we could say about Asmi Mana is the way it is experienced or plays out in ordinary life. And this is quite an interesting thing to contemplate and to watch for. Is Asmi Mana takes three forms. There's the perception that I am superior to you, I'm better than you somehow. The perception that I am lesser than you, I'm inferior to you. And there's the perception that I am your equal. And all three of these perceptions are wrong, in error, false. And they're based on an imperfect perception. I think if that was better understood, we might solve a lot of problems in the world. So that's some ramblings from different directions about the teaching of not self and the broader teaching of emptiness. So I'll stop my conclude my formal remarks at this juncture, and I'll be looking at the chat to see if anybody has questions. I'm not seeing anything in the chat. I don't know if that's because my chat's not working or because nobody has any questions. Let me see if I can refresh this. Okay. Okay. is asking, the Buddha remembered previous lives. How does that reconcile with not self? Yes, frequently asked question. Um, yeah, as I mentioned in the talk, this is something that comes up again and again. It actually came up in the Buddhist time too. People would ask versions of this question: how can the Buddha teach not self and rebirth? And the answer is that the question itself is based on a false assumption that there's anything which continues from moment to moment in this life. So then one assumes that um, for there to be a rebirth, there must be a continuation of substance of some kind. But this was explicitly denied by the Buddha. When one of the monks made the statement that he understands the Buddha's teaching to be that this consciousness which arises here and now, it is this very consciousness which arises again somewhere else. And the Buddha said he was a very foolish man, that there is nothing which continues from life to life, but there is a continuity of pattern. Recommend further readings. Yeah, there are some. There's quite a bit written on these topics. I'm trying to remember the author's name. It's not coming to me, but there's a book called Thoughts Without a Thinker. It's very good. And my mind is drawing a blank on authors' names right now, but there's another one that's uh, just called Emptiness. It's quite good. Um, you can go back to the original sources if you that analogy of the chariot comes from the Melinda Panya. And there's quite a bit about emptiness in the Samyutta Nikaya. Yeah, yeah, that's a kind of Adi. That's Adol. That's a kind of poetic way of phrasing it. But yeah, I don't really have any objection to it. He says you are basically everything and everyone and nothing and nobody at the same time. What's the difference between a preview of Nibbana and the commonly called blackout? Well, it's all the difference in the world. Nibbana is not a blackout at all. Uh, the blackout is just a cessation of consciousness. Nibbana is a realization of the unconditioned. Oh, from the experience perspective, well, there are two diametrically opposed experiences. You can't compare the two. Don't think of Nibbana as being some kind of a blackout. It's completely wrong. is the Theravada stance on emptiness different from that of Vajrayana? I would say, in essence, not. Um, now, there's a kind of a what would we call it? A historical or a scriptural issue that comes up here. If you read Vajrayana books, you'll often see them critique what they call the Hinayana view as being that the Hinayanists understood well enough Anata, not self, of the person, but didn't understand emptiness of the Dhammas. So didn't understand the general principle of sunyata. And some of the modern Tibetan writers even go so far because uh, they realize that Theravadins don't like to be called Hinayana. It's kind of pejorative, so they refer to that as the Theravadan view, and it's not the Theravadan view. The Vajrayana root schools in India before they went to Tibet, the older schools of Buddhism that they would have been in contact with were Sarvastavadan and Dharmaguptaka and a few others, but they would not have had any direct contact with the Theravadins who were established in the south. So it becomes quite misleading. And I don't even know if it's a fair critique of those schools, but it's certainly not of the Theravada. Yeah, I'm not really familiar with the principles of semiotics, but sounds sounds right to me. What you put there, Hua. I think in terms of the not of semiotics, but in terms of physics, that until consciousness, or as the physicists call it, the observer makes an observation, a measurement, the electron doesn't exist at a point. It only exists as a fuzzy probability wave with different, probabilities of occurring at different points. But you can take a measurement and determine the position of the electron, but then you lose all information about its momentum once you determine its position. Or you can determine its momentum. This is the Heisenberg uncertainty principle. If you determine the momentum precisely, you lose all information about its position. Or you might have like a 50% probability for each and have a fuzzy general view somewhere in between. So that reality, in that view, reality, external reality, is not a concretized thing until consciousness gets involved in it. How can one balance understanding of not self with socializing in ordinary life? Um, I think it should, if not self is understood and internalized and acted on, then it would make interaction with other beings much more fluid and easy and compassionate, because you're not defending a position. You're not uh, taking a self position that needs to be staked out and defended and exist by challenging other person's self position. You see the interaction as just an interaction of factors. Yes, okay. That Adol has defined the semiotic position there. Yeah, from what you are saying about that, it sounds right. I'm not familiar with that school of thought to say anything really intelligent about it. Just a surface impression that relates very much to what topic I spoke about last week about perception. That the reality we actually experience is not a concrete external reality, but it's our mental construction of the sense data. So reality is always interpreted through the mind, and through several different functions of the mind, beginning with perception. Or beginning with sense consciousness, actually, before it even is passed on to perception. Uh, well, solipsism would be the kind of ultimate self view. Nothing exists but the self. Yes, the, the mind is essentially luminous. It says in Guru Nikaya. Yeah, yes. Um, the luminosity of the chitta is how it perceives objects. There's an image from Zen Buddhism, or one of the little teaching stories. The two monks discussing the nature of mind. And one of them says that it's like a mirror set up in a high place. That's brilliant, uh, finely polished and brilliant, and illuminates the 10,000 things, and they're reflected in the face of the mirror. And the other one says that's not quite right. The way I see the mind, it's like a mirror, polished, set up in a high place that illuminates the 10,000 things, but nothing is reflected in the face of the mirror thereby. And I think we're sort of drawing to a close here. Uh, so now I got maybe one more question here. Would memory be the main culprit in maintaining perception of the self? Yeah, this is a good question because this is another thing is in relation to time. If you think about it, and you notice that the self only ever exists in relation to the past or future. Now, here's what I mean by that. If you um, take the past as memory, your history, if someone asks, "Who are you?" The natural human kind of answer to that's my name, my job, where I live, where I went to school, like that. Right? That's your history. It has a relation to the past. Or you project into the future and you imagine, either with hope and dreaming about some great future, or in fear and anxiety about some impending catastrophe, but you're projecting a self into the future. But if you're just completely in the present moment, where's the self then? Who are you then? doesn't make any sense. You can't find any relation point for yourself in the exact present moment. So I think I'll take leave now. Thank you all very much for coming, and this will be up on the website on the channel. So anyone who wants to watch it later will be available. So thank you all very much for coming, and see you next week.